I joked about going on a date with his boss this Friday, but he took it seriously and took revenge. If someone told me that a tiny offhand joke would end up costing me my entire relationship, I'd probably have laughed it off. But here I am, wishing I could take it all back. Hey guys, I have made some pretty big mistakes, and now I'm here to share my story, hoping maybe some of you can relate or at least give me some feedback. To be honest, this is a tough one to put into words. It's one of those things I wish I could rewind, but life doesn't exactly come with a rewind button, does it? This whole mess started over something I thought was completely innocent, a joke I made to my boyfriend, Mark. And now, looking back, I can see it wasn't as innocent as I convinced myself it was. I should have paid more attention to the warning signs, the little red flags that I brushed off, but I didn't. I didn't take it seriously. And I definitely didn't think Mark would either. Now I'm stuck here, dealing with the fallout, feeling like I threw everything away over a joke that wasn't even funny. So here's a little backstory for you guys. My name's Claire, and I've been with Mark for about 5 years now. Well, I was with him. And we met through a mutual friend back when I was still in my 20s and thought I had life figured out. It was one of those classic girl meets guy at a party moments. I remember being instantly attracted to him because he had this quiet confidence about him. You know, he wasn't trying too hard to impress anyone. He was just solid. We clicked right away, and after a few more hangouts, it felt like we were glued together. The first year was amazing. We couldn't keep our hands off each other, and it felt like the honeymoon phase was never going to end. We'd spend weekends exploring new places, binge watching shows, trying out new restaurants. It felt like life was one big adventure. But like with most relationships, things eventually leveled out. The excitement faded a bit, and our relationship settled into a steady, comfortable routine. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't bad. It was actually nice, but it wasn't like it was before. Mark started focusing more on his career, which I understood. He's got this strong work ethic, and he takes his job seriously. He's one of those people who can't stand letting others down. So he'd often put in extra hours, even on weekends, just to stay on top of things. He's dependable, like that's someone you can trust to always be there, even if it's not in the most romantic way. I suppose I could tell you a few things about myself now. It might seem like I'm smiling all the time, and I do consider myself as a very sociable, extrovert individual. Of course, some may deem this too friendly. Heck, if we're being picky, overly friendly. I have a habit of flirting without even noticing that I'm doing so. Hey, I'm not even aware of it most of the time. It is who I am, and it should not hurt anyone. I like making people laugh, feel happy, and yeah, get some attention once in a while. He knew this from the start, and honestly, he never did mind. I mean, he was not jealous in any way possible. He wasn't insecure in the slightest. Perhaps it was as simple as that he had learned to rely on me and did not think it necessary to concern himself with my actions. He'd either roll his eyes at me or nudge me gently if he felt that I was getting too close to someone, which was the extent of his jealousy. We both knew where we were coming from, or so I thought I had understood. Looking back now, I wonder if I took his calmness for granted. Mark's one of those guys who likes stable and predictable. He's the type who'd much rather stay and then go out partying. I think he liked that I was the more lively one. It balanced us out, you know? I'd bring excitement, and he'd keep us grounded. I thought we had a good thing going, and it slowly dawned on me that the flame was not as bright. We didn't hug as often anymore, and casual dates became nights where we'd just hang out and stay in to eat. There's always that point in a relationship where you become so used, so familiar with your partner that you relax and stop trying so hard. And yeah, possibly I felt a little insignificant. Am I wrong? It sounds rather evil, but that is the way it is, at least for me. I began needing that feeling again of being perceived, valued. And to be quite frank with you, I would tease just to feel that attention dearth I imagined I suffered from. Mark didn't pick up on it, or maybe he did and just didn't say anything. He's not the type to start arguments or make a fuss. Like I said, he's steady and doesn't let things rattle him easily. He values his peace, his work, his routines. He had his goals, and he was focused on those, especially in the last couple of years. I think he was working toward a promotion or something. I could tell he wanted to make a good impression on his boss, and he'd bring up work a lot more often. He was becoming more serious about his career, and that's something I respected about him. He made sure that his boss was happy with his work. But with him going out to work, I began to feel as if I was being sidelined in his life. I became deck K in his life and could not understand whether or not he still found me attractive. I never told him any of this. I thought that it was just a phase that we were going through and that things calmed down on their own. Besides, I thought he would casually dismiss it and tell me that I over-exaggerate things. And maybe I was, but that's where everything started to shift. I didn't see it coming, and I didn't think one little joke could change our whole relationship. But here we are. So this is where things get a little messy. I'd heard about Mark's boss a few times before I actually met him. Mark talked about him here and there, sometimes with respect, sometimes with, caution. His name was Ian, and he was in his early S. The way Mark described him, Ian sounded like one of those people who just lit up a room without even trying. Confident, charismatic, always saying the right thing. The kind of guy you couldn't help but notice. Mark always made it clear that he had to stay on Ian's good side. It wasn't that Ian was a bad person, but Mark knew Ian was the type to have high standards and expect a lot from the people working for him. Mark would come home sometimes and tell me how hard he'd worked on a project, just for Ian to ask for a few more improvements. It was like he respected Ian, but was also wary of him. Like he knew that one mistake could make or break his standing at work. I could tell it stressed him out, but he wanted to make a good impression. Anyways, the first time I got to see Ian in real life was when he was working for a company's team building event. Mark did not wish to go there. He is not an outgoing person, but Ian had extended everyone an invite, so Mark had no option other than to accept. I followed along because it was likely to be a fun night out, and because it was an opportunity to meet the man whose name was always on everybody's lips. I could call this experience of mine as a dream that came true, and yet I do not know why I feel that way. And well, Ian was exactly like I'd imagined, tall, a little gray in his hair, but in a way that just made him look even more distinguished. He had this easy, relaxed confidence that made everyone around him look up when he walked into the room. I noticed the way people gravitated toward him, like they were eager to impress him. And okay, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little intrigued by him too. When Mark introduced us, Ian smiled, shook my hand, and just held eye contact for a second longer than I'd expected. He complimented me on my dress, which, honestly, caught me a bit off guard. I wasn't used to people giving me that kind of attention lately, so I just kind of laughed and thanked him, brushing it off like it was nothing. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't deny that I felt a little thrill like I hadn't felt in a long time. All night I would see him looking at me, and don't even get me wrong, I know this is incredibly typical. I'm not trying to justify it here. I just feel like it was nice to be seen and valued for something other than being Mark's girlfriend. It was harmless, Frank, or at least it's what I was trying to convince myself all along. A glance or two, a word or two did not matter. It may not be anything at all, right? But at one point in the evening, when Mark was off talking to a coworker, Ian came over to me and we chatted for a bit. He asked about what I did for work, told me a bit about the company, and made me laugh with a few funny stories about his early days in business. I don't know how he did it, but he just had this way of making me feel important, like I was the only person in the room. In my case, to be quite honest, I didn't even pay much attention to it at first. I wasn't aching for anyone, and he never touched me wrong, but I still had that curiosity, you know? And I wasn't used to it. Once in a while, when a knock causes me to lose my balance, I pray for the opportunity to be seen that way again. And for the smallest of instances, I became the different person I wanted to be, the jovial me that I probably lost touch with. Mark didn't seem to notice. He was busy with his colleagues, and by the end of the night, we just went home like it was any other evening. I didn't even mention Ian or how he'd been so attentive, so friendly. I didn't see the point. It was just harmless, right? I mean, Mark already had enough to deal with at work. I figured the last thing he'd need was me talking about how his boss was this charming, magnetic person. I thought it was over, that it was just a one-time thing, a little ego boost, but looking back now, I guess that was the first misstep. The first little spark that would eventually ignite something I couldn't control, and I had no idea what was waiting for me down the road. You can say that it was a big surprise for me. Therefore, one evening when Mark and I were just at home, we were on the couch just chit-chatting about work, other things, what we have planned for the weekend, and other normal stuff. Basically, I might have been in the mood to tease him or was just plain bored. That's why I said it. It was a joke. He was supposed to laugh it off. In fact, I had planned to follow it up with a punchline. For the life of me, I do not know what brought this on, but as if from thin air, I blurted out, "He looks like he'd be a whole lot of entertaining." I expected Mark to just roll his eyes or laugh it off like he usually did when I was being silly, but he didn't. He just stared at me for a second, and I could see this flicker of something annoyance, maybe even heard across his face. He let out this short, humorless laugh and said, "Yeah, right." I laughed too, trying to keep it light like it was no big deal. "Oh, come on, I'm kidding," I told him. But the look he gave me, it wasn't one I'd seen before. It was this mix of disbelief and maybe a little anger. That look should have been my first clue that I'd crossed a line, but I was too wrapped up in my own little joke to think much of it. I figured he'd forget about it in a few minutes, but he didn't. That is why the rest of the evening seemed uncomfortable. He went silent, and when I attempted to start up a conversation with him, all he would say were dry responses. I knew something was wrong, but I never gave it much thought and carried on by assuming he was just stressed from work or had issues going through his mind. He never mentioned the joke again, and I didn't either. To me, it was just a means of having some fun and tossing the ball in the other court. But now I see that was the time when everything began to change in our relations. We had become closer to each other. Over the next few days, I noticed that he wasn't acting like himself. Usually we'd text each other during the day, just little updates or random things to make each other smile. But now his messages were short, like he couldn't be bothered. He'd come home from work and barely talk to me, just mutter a few words and disappear into his office or turn on the TV. It was like he was there physically, but mentally he was somewhere else. I tried asking him if everything was okay, but he just shrugged it off. "I'm fine," he'd say, or just work stuff. He wasn't the type to open up easily, so I didn't push it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like this invisible wall had gone up between us, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get past it. A few times, I almost brought up the joke again, thinking maybe I should apologize or explain that I hadn't meant anything by it. But I kept stopping myself thinking, come on, it was just a joke. He couldn't really be that bothered by it, right? I convinced myself that I was overthinking things and that he'd eventually snap out of it. In fact, it was like the distance between us was only growing. We used to spend weekends together, even if it was just running errands or grabbing coffee. Now he'd make excuses to be out on his own or hang back at work longer than usual. The more he pulled away, the more anxious I got. I'd find myself waiting by my phone for a text or hoping he'd come up to me and give me a hug or say something to let me know we were okay. But that never happened. And now it seemed he was getting more and more distant, and I had no idea how to pull him back. I began to feel that possibly he had not regarded my joke in the same uncomplicated fashion that I had myself. Perhaps he read it in a way I never wanted to accept, even if I did not notice. At that point, I still had no idea that he was planning anything, that he'd even think about taking revenge. I thought he'd just need some time, that he'd get over it eventually. But looking back now, I can see that he was already pulling back, already calculating his next move, and I was completely oblivious, thinking it would all just blow over. A couple of weeks after that joke with Mark, we were invited to another work event. It was one of those fancy dinners where everyone dresses up, makes small talk, and pretends to care about work even outside of work hours. Mark wasn't thrilled about going, and honestly, neither was I. Things had been tense between us since that night on the couch, and he was still acting a little distant, like he was there physically but checked out mentally. But when we arrived, I spotted Ian almost immediately. He was standing by the bar, laughing with a few coworkers, looking as charming as ever. It's like he just knew how to command a room without even trying. I caught his eye, and he waved, flashing that same friendly smile he'd had the first time we met. We said our standard greetings, and after a while, Mark was drawn into talking with some of his coworkers. I ended up at the bar next to him. As much as I weighed the possibility of getting up and leaving, he turned to look at me, lifted his glass in a toast, mumbled something along the lines of, "Hey stranger, long time no see." It felt natural, harmless, just two people chatting. We got to talking, and well, he's the kind of guy who makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. I know it sounds ridiculous, but after the way things have been going with Mark lately, it felt good to be noticed, to be seen. I remember laughing at something Ian said, and he leaned in, lowering his voice, saying, "You're way too fun to be left alone here." Mark's a lucky guy, and maybe it was the way he said it, or maybe it was the wine I'd had by then. but I felt this rush. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't help myself. I let my guard down. We kept talking, and our conversation drifted into this flirty banter that, looking back, was more than it should have been. I was pushing boundaries and I knew it, but I kept going anyway. At some point, Ian got up and said that we needed to get out for a while and get some fresh air. There was a little patio with around 4 tables, and we located one of them in the corner of the patio. We talked about random things, everyday interactions, employment, common chit-chat. But there was the conflict brewing, manifesting. This I knew was risky business, but I thought that this is what we all do for a lark. I tried to persuade myself that it was just a moment of flirty acting and that it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But then one thing led to another. I don't even know how it happened. One minute we were laughing, and the next he leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath on my skin. And I didn't stop him. I didn't pull away. Instead, I closed the gap between us. There was this thrill, this rush of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. And in that moment, I wasn't thinking about Mark or the consequences or anything else. It just happened. Afterward, the reality of the situation set in with me like a ton of bricks. We both sprang up quickly, realizing the gravity of our actions momentarily hitting us still. I looked at Ian, who must have noticed my anxious expression. He simply nodded before going back here. I sat out there for a few minutes and tried my best to motivate myself to do whatever it took to get the guilt feeling out of my system. I kept on asking myself, what have I done? The guilt was overwhelming. I knew I'd messed up big time, but at the same time, a part of me felt exhilarated. It was like I tapped into this part of myself that I hadn't felt in years. I hated that I felt that way, but it was the truth. I couldn't deny that in the moment, it had felt thrilling. But now, standing there alone on that patio, all I felt was regret. When I got back inside, Mark was still talking to his coworkers, oblivious to what had just happened. I tried to act normal, but my mind was spinning. I couldn't look him in the eye without feeling this weight pressing down on my chest. He didn't notice anything off, though, and as the night went on, I somehow managed to keep up appearances. The whole way home, I was silent, my thoughts racing a mile a minute. Part of me wanted to tell Mark to just get it out in the open and deal with it. But I knew it would destroy him and probably our entire relationship. I couldn't bear the thought of that. So, I made a decision. I told myself that I'd just forget it ever happened, that I'd bury it deep and never speak of it again. I kept thinking it was a mistake, a one-time thing. I can move past this. We can move past this. But that voice in the back of my head kept reminding me of what I'd done, and it wouldn't let me go. The next few days were a blur of mixed emotions. I catch myself replaying that moment with Ian in my mind, feeling that same thrill, and then immediately drowning in guilt right after. I kept thinking about Mark, about the trust he'd always had in me, and I hated myself for what I'd done. But every time I thought about confessing, I'd back out, telling myself it was better left unsaid. I tried to put on a brave face to act like nothing was wrong, but I could feel the distance growing between us. Mark still seemed a little off, but I figured he was just stressed from work. And me, I was stuck in this silent torment, feeling like I was living a double life, one part of me aching with regret, and the other part trying to pretend like nothing had changed. I kept telling myself that it was just a mistake, that I'd never do it again. And I believed it too. I wanted to believe that I could go back to how things were before, that I could just push it all down and move on. But deep down, I knew I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. And somehow I knew that nothing was ever going to be the same again. Little did I know the secret I thought I could bury wasn't going to stay buried for long. And Mark, he'd already started putting pieces together. Seeing right through the cracks, I thought I'd covered up so well. I just didn't see what was coming. What I didn't realize was that Mark hadn't taken my joke as lightly as I thought. He was a lot more aware than I gave him credit for. From the moment I'd made that comment about going out with his boss, he'd started noticing things, small things, maybe things I thought were nothing, but he was piecing them together one by one. I guess that's where I really messed up. I'd assumed he didn't care enough to pay attention, that he was too wrapped up in his work to see any of the subtle changes in me. But he was watching, and he could tell that something was different. He'd notice when I'd suddenly go quiet or act distant, moments when I'd stare off, lost in my thoughts. Things I thought he wouldn't even notice or question. It didn't help that I hadn't exactly been myself around him. I'd been so caught up in my own guilt and confusion that I'd pulled away without even realizing it. We stopped going out together, and he'd come home later and later. He didn't talk as much. His texts became almost robotic. At first I thought he was just stressed with work, but then it started to feel more deliberate, like he was purposefully keeping his distance. It was as if he'd started building this wall between us, and I had no idea why. But you'll never guess what I didn't know. He had been doing some investigation of his own. Mark has not been part of the people who would break into someone's house only to go through their things. However, once he saw an opportunity, he took time to spy. Perhaps he was glancing at my phone when I wasn't paying him any attention. Or he'd briefly checked a few things when I stepped out of the room. Or he might have heard me say something at work. They say what matters is not the end, but the means that were used to get there. And what he did find must have been enough to cement his suspicions. And yet he didn't confront me. Not right away, at least. Instead, he kept it to himself, which somehow made it worse. He'd go days without saying much. No more asking about my day or making plans for the weekend. I started to feel like I was living with a stranger, someone who was just there but not really present. It was unsettling, and I could feel something big was coming, but he didn't give me any clues. It was like he was waiting, watching, and letting me dig myself deeper without even realizing it. I wanted to ask him what was going on, but a part of me was too scared of what he might say. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home, constantly anxious and second-guessing everything I did. Every little silence, every sidelong glance, everything felt like a warning, but I kept telling myself I was just imagining it. But deep down, I knew I could feel it. Mark knew something, and he was just waiting for the right moment to let me know that he knew. And there was nothing I could do but wait for it to happen. It was a normal evening, or at least I thought it was going to be. I'd just gotten home from work, and Mark was already there, sitting on the edge of the couch, looking like he'd been waiting for me. There was something different about him, though this calmness that felt almost cold. I walked in, gave a little smile, but he didn't smile back. He just stared at me, his face completely blank. Before I could even ask him what was wrong, he spoke. "So, how was your night with Ian?" He asked, his voice icy, almost detached. My heart stopped. It was like everything around me froze, and I felt this wave of panic wash over me. I tried to play dumb, to pretend like I didn't know what he was talking about, but he didn't let me get a word out. "Don't bother," he said, holding up his hand. "I know everything." I stood there speechless, feeling this heavy pit in my stomach. I wanted to say something to try and explain, but he wasn't giving me the chance. He went on calmly, like he was reading off a list. He knew where we'd gone that night, the way we'd stayed outside, how long we'd been alone. He even knew details that I hadn't told anyone, stuff I thought was buried in my own mind. I could feel my face getting hot, and my hands started to shake. It was like my worst nightmare was playing out right in front of me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I tried to apologize, to tell him it had been a mistake, but he didn't want to hear it. "Stop," he said, his voice sharp and final. "I don't want your apologies. I don't even want an explanation." I was stunned. I kept expecting him to yell, to get angry, to say something that would let me know how he was feeling, but he was eerily calm, like he'd already made up his mind long before this moment. And then, just as I was struggling to find the right words, he dropped the bombshell. "I've started packing my things," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm done with this, Claire. I'm done with you." I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, to tell him that we could work through this. But the way he was looking at me, it was like he didn't even know me anymore. Like I was just a stranger who had somehow wandered into his life and ruined everything. "You're leaving?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely holding together. "Yes," he replied almost coldly. "I don't want anything to do with you. I don't need someone who's going to joke about dating my boss and then actually go through with it." He shook his head, and there was this look of utter disappointment on his face. "You betrayed me, Claire, and I'm not going to stick around for someone who has that little respect for me." I tried one last time, reaching out, tears welling up in my eyes. "Mark, please, we can fix this. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking, but he cut me off again. No, Claire, I don't care why you did it. I don't care what you were thinking. I'm done." And that was it. He stood up, walked to the door, and turned back one last time. I'll come by tomorrow to pick up the rest of my things. I don't want to see you, so just don't be here." His voice was so matter-of-fact, so emotionless, that it made everything hurt even more. He didn't yell. He didn't break down. He just left, like he was erasing me from his life. As the door closed behind him, I was left standing there completely alone. My heart shattered into a million pieces. It was like my whole world had come crashing down, and there was nothing I could do to put it back together. I wanted to hate him for being so cold, for walking out without a second thought, but I couldn't. I knew that he was right. I had betrayed him, and this was the price I had to pay. At that moment, I realized there was no going back. Mark was gone, and I was left to face the consequences of my own choices. It felt like I was drowning in regret, knowing that a single stupid joke had spiraled into something that had cost me everything. And now all I had left was an empty house and a heart full of regret. In the weeks that followed, everything just fell apart. Mark completely cut me off. He blocked me on all social media, erased every trace of me from his life, as if we'd never even been together. Any mutual friends we had, they all took his side, which honestly I can't blame them for. I don't know what he told them, but whatever it was enough to make them vanish from my life too. It felt like I'd lost everyone in one fell swoop. I'd hear things here and there, bits and pieces of what was happening from people who still knew both Mark and Ian. Apparently word got around about Ian and me. Someone at work must have found out because I heard that Ian's boss had called him in for some sort of discussion. He kept his job, but let's just say his reputation took a hit. And his marriage? Well, that wasn't looking too great either. From what I gathered, his wife found out about what happened between us, and things got messy fast. I never heard the full details, but I know they're not in a good place. And as for me, I've been left to sit here with nothing but my own thoughts. I can't even put into words how much I regret everything. I look back now, and I can barely recognize myself. All of this chaos because of one stupid, careless joke. I thought it was innocent, harmless fun. I convinced myself it didn't mean anything. But in reality, it spiraled into something I couldn't control, something that ended up destroying everything I cared about. It's hard to explain, but Mark's revenge cutting me off, erasing me from his life, it hurt in ways I never expected. And the worst part is deep down I know I deserved it. He didn't yell, he didn't make a scene. He just left with a kind of quiet finality that made me realize how badly I'd hurt him. He took his dignity with him, leaving me to face the wreckage I'd created. I've tried to move on, but every time I close my eyes, it's like I'm right back in that moment, seeing Mark's face, hearing the disappointment in his voice. I don't know if I'll ever fully get over it. The guilt is suffocating. It's a lesson I've learned the hard way, one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. So, yeah, that's my story. One joke, one moment of weakness, and now I'm left to pick up the pieces alone. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes you can't take back the things you say or do. You can only live with the consequences. And that's what I'm doing, trying to live with what I did and hoping somehow to find a way forward. Update. Hey everyone, I thought I'd post a little update since some people were asking if I ever reached out to Mark or if we talked again. The truth is, I did try reaching out a few times actually. I sent him a couple of messages just trying to explain myself or at least apologize properly. But he never replied, not once. He's completely shut me out, and honestly, I can't blame him. I think I already knew deep down that this was a door he was never going to open again. It's been a few weeks now, and I'm just here trying to pick up the pieces of my life and make sense of how everything went so wrong so fast. I spent a lot of time thinking, replaying moments over and over in my head, trying to understand what drove me to make such a stupid mistake. I can see now how careless I was, how I let my own insecurities cloud my judgment. And looking back, I wish I'd appreciate what I had before I lost it. I know that I lost someone irreplaceable. Mark was solid, dependable, the kind of person who doesn't come around often. I took that for granted. I thought our relationship could survive anything, even my own selfish mistakes. But I was wrong. If there's one thing I can say after all this, it's that trust and loyalty are everything. I didn't realize just how fragile they were until I shattered them. And now all I can do is live with that regret and try to be better. So that's it. That's my story. I don't know what's next for me, but I'm just taking it day by day. And if there's anyone out there listening, I hope you can learn from my mistakes. Don't let pride or a moment of weakness ruin something real, because once it's gone, you can't get it back. Thanks for hearing me out.